Adin Lenchner is a campaign strategist and voting rights advocate leading Carol Stream Campaigns, an organization focused on narrative strategy and digital infrastructure for grassroots electoral organizing. Welcome, Adin.
Thanks very much. Happy to be here.
So, I've this podcast is dedicated to making our union more perfect. And one of the keys here is that, voting is such an important thing that I think too many people take for granted. Certainly after the 2024 election and the 2025 elections, we've seen a lot of differences between those two. There was a sense of apathy, I felt like, in 2024, the both sidesism factor. We're coming up on the 2026 midterms. What is the biggest, there we go, civic infrastructure failure you're seeing right now?
Look, I mean, I'll start just by saying I'm someone who got involved in politics for the very first time, not just inspired by this kind of generational enthusiasm around President Obama's first campaign for president, but just as impactfully, someone who just after he was elected, it was a year where we saw Time Magazine had the cover "Year of the Voter." Right? We were talking about this kind of true generational shift. Someone who was shocked to learn that once in a lifetime voter turnout percentage was just 60%, which means that 4 in 10 voters, even in a year as inspirational as President Obama's first run for president against such a stark contrast as Senator John McCain, stayed home because they were alienated by politics. I think the biggest piece that's keeping people at home is just a lack of faith in government, a lack of faith in both parties and institutions, that their lives will be meaningfully changed. They simply, they read the news, they follow what's happening, and simply don't believe that their elected officials are looking out for them. It's partly why I think, when we see elected officials that are really able to cut through that noise, and I think we're seeing, a great example is Zohran Mamdani's campaign here in New York, really is around candidates that are able to credibly and authentically represent themselves as being someone who's actually going to meaningfully make people's lives better. And voters want to believe in that, want to give them a chance. And so I think as we're looking towards 2026, we'll be seeing a real test of a campaign's success will be whether voters believe that candidate is sincere, and whether they have the values, the credibility to be able to build a campaign around that kind of authentic representation of the values that voters are looking to see.
Yeah, I think there's and to kind of go off what you said is that there's this both sidesism that goes, well, they're both, the lesser of two evils is the very common phrase that's being said. And yeah. I think with Zohran Mamdani, I never pronounced his name correctly. I tried my hardest, but it just, my mouth and those words don't work well together. But his optimism and his enthusiasm, and I think his willingness to meet the voters where they were, as opposed to trying to convince them that he had all the answers, was something that is very unheard of, because there's this tendency, and when you put your faith in anyone, right, you're bound to be disappointed, because that person is going to be a human being and fail at some point. Now, it could be systemic failure, it could be structural failure, it can be personal failures, it can be family, it can be familial failures. There can be so many areas for a failure to happen for a candidate. And what I think was remarkable about him was that he was more concerned about the people than he was about putting forth his 10-point plan or his 20-point plan or whatever, and listening to them and seeing what is important to them. How can I work towards helping these people that I want to vote for me, rather than how can I implement these ideas that I have, right? Very other focused as opposed to,
Yeah.
self focused. And I think that was such an important part of his campaign that I thoroughly enjoyed and loved. And I mean, I didn't get to vote for him, but I would have if I could have. And that's my biggest, litmus test is this somebody that I would vote for? If I saw if they were on my ballot, and the answer is for him, yes, I would have voted for him. But I was listening to a podcast this morning that was talking about the difference between Abigail Spanberger
Mhm.
and Zohran Mamdani, and they were saying that they're almost a Venn diagram of a circle in in what they do, but that they're painting Abigail as too moderate, and they're painting Zoran as being too progressive, and it's just very interesting because their policies and what they're looking to achieve are very similar to each other, and so it's what can demonize the other side easiest, right? You're too progressive or you're too moderate.
Sure.
How One of the things that I was reviewing your website, you're talking about narrative politics, and how do you define narrative power, and why does it matter beyond messaging?
Yeah, I think the simplest way of explaining it is just about how candidates are able to communicate in a way that aligns with the narrative that voters see of the world. That is to say, I think most polls, most research now shows a pretty consistent um, picture of the world, which is that groceries are expensive, electricity, rent is incredibly expensive, um, and this dream, the true American dream that most American families were raised with, that this is a meritocracy where if you work hard, you can succeed and build a better life than your parents had, is becoming increasingly out of reach for most people. And so when they are looking for candidates that inspire them and also that can believably help to make that dream a reality, um, they're looking for people that not just have the experience, but are also able to speak about it in a way that actually matches how people are thinking about it. So that is to say, like, um, I think there's a big reason, and obviously this has been talked about, to death. But a big reason that Donald Trump has been successful is he's angry, and he is able to speak about this in this chasm between the way that Washington works and the way that most families are actually living. Um,
Right.
and there's a way to do, a way to connect, to resonate with voters. That is angry. There's a way to connect with voters that is optimistic. There's a way to connect with voters that feels rooted in experience and practical progress. And I think we've seen, there, depending on your political perspective, you can see success in all sorts of those permutations. But truly, for me, I look at this as um, whether candidates, whether elected officials speak about the reality of American life in a way that feels resonant
Right.
um, to to most people's experiences. And so, increasingly, I think we're seeing kind of a new generation of political candidates that are from a whole broad spectrum of backgrounds and experiences. That's ethnicities, that's economic backgrounds, professional backgrounds. Obviously there was a time when you only got really elected to office because you were the son of a senator, or you were a lawyer. And now we're seeing um, tribal leaders in Deb Holland. We're seeing lobster fishermen in Grand Platner
Right.
in Maine. Um, and we're seeing organizers and activists like Cori Bush. And so I think, increasingly we're seeing candidates that are able to speak to the different parts of people's hearts. And I think when voters feel like their candidates are in this world with them,
Right.
and seeing the world the same way that they do, that really resonates.
Why do you think Donald Trump's anger message resonates so strong with MAGA? And I ask, let me kind of expound on what I mean by that, because
Sure.
I always look at politics as, yeah, there's some negative in politics, obviously, but there's a lot to be positive about too, and maybe I'm a little naive on that one. But I like West Wing, right? Like, that's actually one of the things that got me interested in politics, was seeing a government that was positive and looked to do good. So why is it that MAGA resonates so hard with the Trump anger and animosity towards immigrants and just everything that seems to bubble through on Trump and his hatred, it seems like, of everything and everyone other than himself?
Yeah. Um, I put it in a couple different categories. One is like that material stress is constant, right? For most people, life feels harder and more fragile than it did a decade ago. That's housing, that's childcare, that's healthcare, that's food costs that seem to rise faster than wages, and everything feels less stable, more
Right.
surveilled, more disposable than it ever has. And even when you're doing everything right, that no longer guarantees security. Not security for your family, but even economic security. And so that, I think, produces this kind of chronic stress, and chronic stress turns into anger when there's no obvious release valve. Um, I think we're also seeing it, institutions that feel unresponsive, right? Kind of as I was saying before, people are taught that democracy, that markets, that expertise are supposed to solve problems, but now, we're seeing that governments are slow or gridlocked, corporations that are unaccountable, um, and media that feels either sensational or dismissive. And so
Right.
when you see that systems don't respond, people, stop arguing kind of within those systems and start lashing out at them.
Right.
Um, and and I also, part of this is also just like there's a real loss of dignity, not just money. A lot of anger isn't about income, but it's also about status and respect. People feel like they're being talked down to, or that their work feels invisible, or certainly undervalued.
Right.
Right, they're being underpaid, undervalued in society, and um, and then just lastly, I would say, there's feels like there's less and less of a place to actually put that feeling. That is to say, a lot of the institutions, the organizations where folks would otherwise have an outlet to really be able to express that anger, whether that's their union or their church or civic groups or local institutions, are really diminishing. Um, and so that means more isolation, less community, more um, online expression and less real world connection.
Right.
Um, and so over time, I think all those pieces have really just metastasized, um, and and then you have someone who is um, able to tap into it in a really compelling way in Donald Trump, with none of the moral, ethical withholdings that would otherwise keep someone from um, unleashing um, that kind of emotion. And I think we're seeing the really nasty costs of that unleashed anger. We're seeing it um, in a completely unaccountable response to January 6th. We're seeing it with masked vigilantes in the streets of Minnesota, with no with no credible path to holding to bringing those folks to justice. And so I think most people aren't just angry because they're radical. They're angry because they're feeling stuck and unheard.
Right.
And you know um, as certainly as it relates to the midterms. I think unless we see a really meaningful shift in the balance of power, most folks won't believe that that effort will actually change any outcomes.
Yeah, and I have to wonder though, is it the chicken or the egg, of a problem? Do the systems stop caring, or did the people stop caring first? And that isn't to say that I'm not trying to victim blame here or anything like that. I'm simply acknowledging that it seems to be somewhat of a, correlation may equal causation, but it also might be, that there's some circular effect there, right? Systems stopped caring because people stopped showing up.
Mm-hmm.
I think apathy, if nothing else, Donald Trump has taught a new generation of people how to care about civics, right? And all of a sudden, we have the 1960s again. We have the 1970s again, where people are being unfairly accused of things, and fires and not quite bombings yet per se, but we have single mothers being murdered in the streets, right, with Renee Good, and we have these things, and it's very reminiscent. And then we had a whole lot of civic organization that happened after the 1960s and 70s that we really hadn't seen as much after that, right? Like the system started paying a little bit more of attention because people started being screened. The old saying, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? Like that's just a fact that unfortunately a lot of people have forgotten. I teach business law down at a local community college, and one of the things I try to tell my people is that if they showed up in mass, they could change the face of our democracy in a single election cycle, because they have the numbers to do it. Right? Like, I mean, they have more numbers than the boomers, the Gen X. We're all dying out. They still have the numbers that they could change this, and I think that it's important that we help them understand the importance of showing up, right? And being informed voters. I had she's actually going to be on here again. Her name's Lindsay Cormick. She's a professor of political science. And she talks about how, civics education starts in the home, not in the schools, and that we have to show the children how to vote, not necessarily, guide them on who to vote for, if depending on the situation, but we need to show them, okay, here's where
Sure.
you go to vote. Here's, showing up is part of the thing. That was always part of it. It's so foreign to me because my parents, when I turned 18, that was just what you did. You voted. It was like a rite of passage. I mean, some people got their first pack of cigarettes. I went to vote, right? Like I was more
Yeah.
excited to vote than anything than one of the things that I could think of. And I think it's important that we remember that, we teaching that not just civic duty, right? When it seems like a duty, you're less excited about it. Like when you have to do it because the world's going to fall apart if you don't, right? Like that's not quite as inspiring as it's not just your civic duty, it's your civic honor. It's part of being in a civilized society. And if you want your voice to be heard, you have to show up. Even if it's not heard 100% all of the time, even if you're getting 5%, 5% is better than no percent, right?
Sure.
Leah Littman said, she was on here as well. I said, what do you talk about the people that are scared and tired and they feel like nothing's going to help right now? She said, doing nothing lets them win. And I think that that's such an important part, is that we have to remember that showing up is more than just showing up, right? It's about doing and making it part of your life so that we don't get down to these types of situations again, hopefully.
Yeah.
How do you balance tech tools with human trust? Because we have on one side, we're the most connected world that's ever existed in the history of the world. We can instantaneously, we're currently on a chat here. And yet there's a significant disconnect amongst people, right? How do you balance those two things?
Yeah. Um, I think that, like, at least for me, um, ultimately, people, especially voters, are really good. They've got a good BS o meter. Um, they are able to see whether the person that is delivering this message is someone um, that they can trust, or that at least that they can credibly believe is actually going to deliver um, on what they say. And so I think we're seeing a lot of tech tools that, yes, lower the barrier to entry, or are good at organizing complex ideas and civic and political work, right? That means, like, makes it easier to mobilize folks or easier to organize the data. But ultimately, I think what what we see is the same old is effective. Is the person delivering this message someone that I believe in and trust? Um, and so that means not just someone who is transactional or one way, not someone that's talking down to them, um, or looking to get something out of them, but someone that is really looking to build something with them, and understands what they're going through. Um, and so again, I think there are a number of really exciting candidates that are going to be on the ballot this November, whether that's Mary Patola in Alaska, pardon me, or it's Graham Plattner, whether that's Roy Cooper in North Carolina. These are candidates that have really been able to demonstrate that they understand the practical realities that people are going through.
Right.
And then the tech tools are simply a way to get that message out more broadly, get it out more targetedly, or to be able to make it easier for folks that receive that message to engage in the campaign
Right.
in a meaningful way. And without a doubt, I think this is also going to be a landmark year for seeing, folks use those same kinds of tech tools in really nefarious ways. I mean, it's every single day now that
Right.
you log into Twitter, um, uh, and see some totally disturbed AI version of reality. Some AI manifestation of the disturbed brain of Donald Trump out on the internet. No doubt, other folks are going to follow that lead and share either really bizarre, computer
Right.
generated images, or weird deep fakes of people speaking. And I think um, frankly, I think that too is a good example of whether um, our elected officials have the bravery to be able to lead on that issue and protect people um, from the really upsetting ways that a lot of these AI tools have already been used.
Right.
I just saw the story the other day of how Elon Musk says, in places where it is already illegal, we will not allow people to have AI images generate nude depictions of real people, like in truly the most cowardly and like conservative possible response to that issue. I think people are rightfully anxious about the
Right.
ways in which AI tools and tech tools are going to be able to um, positively impact people's lives, and worried about the ways that they may harm them. And so I think there too, and they're going to be looking for candidates and elected officials that have people's best interest in heart and are able to credibly make a positive case for how they're going to be able to do something about that. And needless to say, the current president doesn't seem to have demonstrated any interest or willingness to do just that, to protect people from the dangers of AI. Rather, he's flying by the seat of his pants and posting these kinds of disturbing pictures online. So
Insane. Yeah.
I think it'll be I guess time will tell how much of an impact that'll make in the midterms. But I think it's just another kind of gross um, uh, uh, measure of the way in which the president doesn't seem to have any kind of ethical or moral qualms about using these tools for for destructive purposes.
Right. And I mean, he has the morals of a gnat, and I would argue maybe even a gnat has more morals than he does. In his most recent wanting to take over Greenland and acting like a petulant child in that pursuit is just, I mean, it's absurd. I mean, we have so
No doubt.
many, we're literally going to go fight a war over a country that the only reason why he wants it is because of the resources, and it's not. There's no real value. When I say value, I mean what some of the really doomsday sayers are like, okay, well, what if the European Union calls in the debt, right, and then it collapses the dollar, and now all of a sudden our economy is in a free fall, right, and I mean, could it happen? Yeah, but I would hope, and this is, I'm no prognosticator of anybody or anything. I would hope the European Union, while they want to stop Donald Trump, would recognize that not the entire country is Donald Trump, and to collapse our dollar and to hurt, the U.S. Isn't in everyone's best interest, right? Like, I mean, I'm hoping that that's true.
Sure.
But at the same time, what if that's the catalyst that stops Donald Trump on a macro level? What are we willing to sacrifice to make sure that we do have a free country? Maybe it's a little damaged, maybe we're a little broken and a little bruised, but if that meant that Donald Trump finally got told no, right? Like, how often does he get told yes on almost everything? The only institution that's pushing back on him has been the courts, and not the Supreme Court, but like the lower district and appellate courts. They're the only ones that have been
Sure.
pushing back. And from a government perspective, the people have been pushing, but it's not the same thing. So he's
Yeah,
only getting
understood.
told no in the courts, and the people are telling him no. But Congress abdicating their role has just been horrific. And I never, in all the growing up, we were taught checks and balances, and the fact that Congress basically said everything is cool, right, to whatever Donald wants to do is just it. I don't have words. I stopped saying I'm blown away because we're past that. We're past that by a lot. Um, so what are some of the campaigns that you've seen that are getting the balance of tech tools and human trust right versus the ones that could use some work?
Um, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I would say, again, I think the broader narrative, the broader messaging frame, um, is way more important than the tools themselves. I mean, I think we're increasingly seeing in campaigns, um, organizing programs leverage what's called relational organizing tools. That means the ways that volunteers and activists are able to help motivate, persuade, turn out their friends, peers, colleagues, family to vote, and tools that make it easier to do that. So to identify folks that are able, folks in their network that are most, the highest targets to be able to turn out. So we're seeing peer-to-peer texting programs, canvassing apps, um, digital, uh, uh, digital organizing hubs that help campaigns mobilize folks faster while still prioritizing that kind of human connection. Um, uh, and um, and I think the ones that flop are the ones where we're seeing folks simply just churning out the same kind of AI slop that most folks are just seeing on the internet. So that's campaigns that don't treat digital tools as replacements for people, but rather they see these tools as real amplifiers um, of human connection. Right? Tech tells you who to talk to, and maybe even how, but it's people that are actually able to convince them, to motivate them, to inspire them. And so I think campaigns that build trust are the ones that are able to use technology to connect, not just to broadcast. Um, and and so I think we're seeing that in a lot of exciting, um, races. I'm based here in New York. We're seeing that with Brad Lander's campaign primary against Dan Goldman here in New York 10. We're seeing that in Alaska with Mary Peltola's campaign, and we're even seeing it in races from Iowa to North Carolina, Florida, really across the country, um, of races where these candidates understand that by using these tools to build efficiency, not to replace that kind of human connection, is really where it's at. The race in Iowa that I was thinking of is Rob Sanders running for governor, who has really been very much someone that I think has been able to capitalize on those kinds of tools to inspire and to more broadly disseminate his message, not just simply to whatever to churn out the worst kinds of meme-based slop that we're seeing in maybe
Yeah.
the more national contexts.
Yeah. How has Kate Connolly been doing?
I'm sorry.
How is Kate Connolly doing against Lawler?
Oh, I think there too, it's looking like more and more folks are jumping into the race. I'm curious how it's going to shake out myself, but
Okay.
I think Lawler, not unlike Stefanik, is someone that really has struggled to move beyond simply um, their antagonism, their confrontational, approach, and their
Right.
association with the president. And I think in some ways they're good representations of what's happening nationally, which is as prices are going up, as the economy is doing worse, as folks are losing more and more faith in the president to be able to actually deliver on his promises. Those that have made a business, made a career off of their associations with that brand, are going to be, increasingly and increasingly weighed down by by those associations, um, and I think that's only to the benefit of the Democrats building their campaigns against them.
Yeah.
If they can build an authentic, positive, and motivated campaign around meaningful ways that can actually improve their lives, not just a contrast with what they're seeing on TV.
Right. Yeah. I had Kate Connolly on. That's why I was asking. I also
Cool.
had Annie Andrews from South Carolina on. So people that I'm following them for obvious reasons, but it's interesting because I also had John Betcha on from where's he at? Can't remember what district he's in. I had Kat Abagazale on as well. So I've had quite a few candidates for Congress and Senate, which was it's really quite interesting. How is Annie Andrews doing? Curious because she's going up against Lindsey Graham.
Yeah, I'm less familiar with her race. I mean, look, South Carolina is an uphill battle,
Yeah.
no doubt. And for all that I think that Lindsey Graham, is truly a representation of just the uh, in some ways everything that Donald Trump campaigned against, which is just the swamp in the worst way. Um, South Carolina is a really tricky district. I would give Annie Andrews the same advice that I give anyone, which is to relentlessly and and specifically talk about the kind of um, practical ways that she can make a difference in people's lives, um, and to try to positively and inspiringly talk about rebuilding that trust that I think a lot of folks have lost in their elected officials to deliver. So not just to make an appearance on TV, to to throw bombs, but to show up in the community and try to meaningfully deliver for people. And I think
Yeah.
at the end of the day, voters are really really hungry for that kind of leadership. Um, and if she's able to build you know, an established and kind of holistic campaign um, around those issues, then I really hope she can be successful.
Yeah. It seems like she does a lot of grassroots and a lot of town halls and stuff like that. So I think she's got the right advice coming in. And she's a pediatrician that works at hospitals. So she's got a lot of non-politics street cred, right? Like that's not what she went to school for. And I think that's important. Like I was telling her, I jokingly said, I'm a walking cliche. If I got into politics, I'm a white male attorney with married and with 6 kids, right? Like I'm quintessential. I'm a cliche when it comes to politics. And I'm not saying I couldn't add value at some point, because I definitely think different than most. But it's like we need less of me and more of her. Right, we need someone, the outside perspective, not the attorney that's making a transition from court to legislation. It's very different. But people think that it's this. People think that, oh well, he's an attorney, so he's going to be good. Well, that's not necessarily accurate. It just means that I know more about the law than the average human being. But when it comes down to legislatively speaking, unless you work in legislation, you don't. I do business transactions and civil litigation. Excuse me. Very different than doing anything legislatively. I had let's see. Let me make sure I get this right, because this was one of the names I got wrong. Maria Mossafar on, and she was talking about her legislative, how she's helped people. There we go. I got it right. Her legislative agenda, and how she's helped people write legislative tools and stuff. And it was very fascinating, because I was interesting, and certainly an area of law that I'm not familiar with, and something that I would love to get into, actually. How do you help organizers stay in the fight without getting burned out? Let's kind of move back to the campaign.
Yeah. Well, first I'll just quickly, to what you were just speaking to. A lifetime ago, I interned on the Hill, and in Senator Gillibrand's office, and I remember being stunned as like an 18, 19-year-old to learn that the folks that were writing healthcare bills were only a couple years older than me, and were not, did not have a lifetime of experience working in healthcare or in community health. They didn't come from, you know, Johns Hopkins or from Mass General. These were kids
Right.
who knew how to research, who knew how to talk to people, who knew how to um, you know consolidate feedback from outside organizations, or from for folks in the community. But I say all that to say that, like, um, you know, a lot of the most successful public leaders are folks, just like in business, are able to hire smart, effective people on their team that um, can become experts on a particular issue.
Right.
Steve Jobs, Jeffrey Bezos, take your pick, right? These are people who, Jeff Bezos didn't wasn't successful because he was an expert in selling books online, or Steve Jobs because he was a graphic designer. These are people that, had a vision and were able to hire really smart, effective teams and build meaningful structure around how to get the most out of those people. So I say all that to say, whether it's Annie Andrews, or Zohran Mamdani or Roy Cooper or any of these other folks that we've been talking about, they're not running for office because they are people that are, the best at writing the bills themselves necessarily,
Right.
but because they are effective, smart um, team leaders.
Right.
And I would hope, that someone like Annie Andrews would be able to bring their experience as a doctor and to lend credibility, um, to healthcare, and to how the federal government, can make an impact on public health. But all that is to say, that those outside perspectives are valuable insofar as we trust them to be able to lead on those issues. And it just goes to say, that like most voters sitting around thinking like, well, I hope this person writes a good bill, is like, no, that's Steve. He's 22. He just graduated from George Washington University, and
Right.
he's he's responding to the letter that you wrote him about Social Security.
Right. Right.
But it also just goes to say, to show how absolutely critical it is, that we have, a meaningful and trusted public, um, civil service,
Right.
of folks that are experts in their field that are actually leading. And of course, this current administration has done everything that they can to, liquidate, those leaders that have been actually executing the very difficult work of leading a federal government.
Right.
But I think folks like, Annie Andrews, that come from this very different, perspective than this, whatever the opposite of tried and true is, of
You're right.
um, of the lawyer, day in and day out, that voters assume will be the best elected official, to folks that actually have the kind of practical lived experience that most people do. Most people are not lawyers,
Right.
or legislators.
Thankfully.
Okay, to your question about organizers. Look, this is I'll give the kind of practical answer, which is, that people get into campaigns because they are inspired, they are values driven, they're mission aligned, and are trying to make their communities in this country a better place. And I'm certainly one of those people, that has allowed, campaigns, elected officials, advocacy organizations to drive, the places that I lend my blood, sweat, and tears. I, for the first 5 years of my career, essentially lived out of my car. As I worked in Colorado and Virginia, in Utah and New Hampshire, in Staten Island and here in New York, being paid very little, barely more than like being paid in bumper stickers, essentially, to fight for the candidates that inspired me. And I think especially when you're someone who is so motivated by what they're seeing in the world, that is a double-edged sword. I think it's incredibly inspiring to be able to read the news every morning and feel like I am doing something about that. And when every day you are fighting off the horrors, of modern life, it can be really hard to stay motivated.
Right.
And I think, unfortunately, campaigns have been a really challenging place, to build a sustainable, a sustainable career. And I say that both from an economic perspective to to just like building your life, everything from like saving to in a 401k to like buying a couch,
Yeah.
keeping in touch with your family and eating well. I mean, all those things become really hard when you're working 80 plus hours a week for very little money in in wherever it is that you've moved across the country to work. And all at the same time, I think there has been this really inspiring, growth of campaign, union organizing. A lot of these, advocacy organizations, and even statewide and federal campaigns that have, unionized their workforces to be able to, um, organize for better pay, for more sustainable hours, and for practical, and accountable goal making, and everything from how many doors you can knock on in a week to,
Right.
how many voters you're expected to register to vote, et cetera. So I think that the balance between those two things, which is, it is and kind of always will be, an industry that is motivated by people's, blood, sweat, and tears, by their enthusiasm and by their kind of, optimistic, vision of the world. And I think it's really important that these campaigns continue to try to provide a little more dignity, a little more better pay, better structure, to be able to keep folks from just working one campaign and then burning out.
Right.
It's it's a really hard industry.
So last question. What keeps you hopeful about this work?
I um, I continue to find um, hope and bright lights across across the this fight. Whether that's the consistent bravery um, of these organizers and protesters that have showed up in the incredible cold in Minnesota, despite being faced with the brutal clampdown of these very nearly goose stepping um, ICE agents, masked, showing up in their homes, in their businesses. The real bravery of folks that are showing up um, to inspire their neighbors and to protect those that are most vulnerable. Whether that's the increasing shifting of the conversation towards real protections and international organizing around the atrocities that are happening in Gaza and in Palestine, and the kind of shifting of the conversation there, or even in the success of candidates that are able to really root themselves in the community. And of course, we've already spoken about Zohran Mamdani's campaign here in New York. His success was built around people's hope and their optimism, that a different kind of candidate from a different kind of background could make a difference in their lives, and not someone who was just simply um, building a campaign based on the same kind of scarcity mindset that I think so many politicians are working with. If I want to build this, I got to take away from there. Here was someone who was talking about how we could build a New York that everyone could be proud of, everyone could own a sense of responsibility, and could make everyone's lives just a little bit easier. Um, and so, yeah, absolutely, I'm inspired by you know the mayor of the largest, greatest city in the world talking about the cost of buying a plate of halal on the
Yeah.
street. Like me and my partner were coming home late from a birthday party. One of my best friends just a couple weeks ago, and God bless America. Here I am having a plate of halal. Surely everyone in the world can relate to wanting, just their food to be a little more affordable, their
Right.
streets to be a little safer, healthcare to be more accessible. And so I'm inspired by um, the continued success of folks that are able to just root their campaigns in kind of humble um, and emotional connection to the communities that they're looking to represent. And I think um, if enough Democrats are able to follow that example in a way that feels um, tailored and really connected to their own districts, their own states, their own communities, the midterms are going to be a really hopeful and exciting year for folks looking to be able to change that narrative, hold this current administration accountable, and build a positive platform for
Very
the
cool.
people they're looking to represent.
Adin, thank you so much for your time today. Where can people find you if they'd like to reach out to you?
Sure. If you just go to carrollstreetcampaigns.com, you can learn more about my business, find a way for us to work together, um, and I hope to connect with some of your listeners soon.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for your time, and wish you the best. And hopefully, you're able to connect with some campaigns and help them with their strategy.
I hope so too. Thank you very much for having me on, Taylor. It's really nice to be here.
Thank you. Well, that was Adin. Excuse me. campaign strategist. It's fascinating to me how he is helping improve the narrative and gain people's attention and trust, and be able to help campaigns transition from the stereotypical campaign to a more trust and values-based campaign. Thank you, and Adin, for joining me.